فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So I'm excited to start season 2 of the Islamic Mary podcast. And in this season, we're going to focus on the amazing and interesting Surat Maryam, or that's the chapter of Mary. And this is a remarkable chapter in the Quran, often overlooked in Quranic studies. And let's start by talking about some fun facts about Mary or Maryam in the Quran. So Maryam is the only female name explicitly mentioned in the Quran. So there are many different female figures. There are ones that are righteous, those who are unrighteous. There are daughters, there are mothers, there are sisters. But Maryam is unique because she's the only one mentioned. And one of the important aspects of Quranic studies is to focus on the names. So when a name is explicitly mentioned, whether that's male or female, the Quran is trying to highlight and focus on that person. So Maryam is a source of inspiration for the Prophet Muhammad as well as the early Muslim community. Also, we see that her name is mentioned 34 times in the Quran, most of the time in referencing being Jesus' mother. So as we discussed, the idea that Maryam is mentioned in connection to Jesus, so Isa ibn Maryam. So Isa is the son of Mary, and there you see that there is a focus on the idea that Jesus is the son of Mary and not necessarily God. And we also see that Maryam is mentioned on her own. And much of this podcast and my forthcoming book will focus on this idea that Maryam has her own story and narrative. She's also mentioned in the prophetic literature as one of the best women. You see that she's mentioned along Khadija, who was the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and then Fatima, who is the daughter. And then we have Abrahamic figures. We have the wife of Pharaoh, Asiya, and then we have Maryam. And we have more verses about her in the Quran than in the Bible. So that's something interesting and unique, and something that sometimes surprises a lot of biblical or Christian audiences, that you have more of a narrative, more of a discussion around her in the Quran than in the Gospels. And you also have the chapter named after her. So this is unique because there are various chapters in the Quran that are named after prophets, such as Ibrahim, Abraham, Yusuf, Joseph, Yunus, Jonah, and we have one chapter named after Maryam that focuses on her narrative and her story. So let's jump in now to Surat Maryam. And Surat Maryam is unique in the Quran because it's the only surah, or only chapter, that starts with the letters Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Slad. And this is important because, as we'll discuss later on, that each chapter begins with something. Sometimes you have letters, sometimes you have general calls speaking to humanity. So here we have a unique beginning. We also see that the surah has a rhyme scheme that's not replicated in other parts of the Quran. So you have the idea of Iya. So as we'll read and discuss together, and we'll hear that Iya is used throughout this chapter. It's from the Meccan era. So as many of you know, the Quran can be divided from Meccan verses to Medinan verses. Of course, there are Meccan surahs and there's Medinan surahs, but many times the Meccan and Medinan verses come together to complete one specific chapter. So we can't speak about a Meccan Quran or Medinan Quran. We do have Meccan verses and Medinan verses in two different eras, but it's one cohesive Quran, and the various verses come together. We also see that this chapter is unique because the name Ar-Rahman, or the most merciful, is mentioned 16 times. Now, of course, the name Ar-Rahman is found in other parts of the Quran. So when you say in the name of God, the most gracious, most merciful, to start a particular chapter, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, you have the word Ar-Rahman. But this chapter is unique that it focuses on this name. So other names may be used, but not as much as Ar-Rahman. And this is the only surah that uses the word wudda, or intense love. So one of the names of God in the Islamic tradition is Al-Wudud, or the one who is loving. And you see this name is paired with being forgiving. وَهُوَ الْغَفُورُ الْوَدُودُ. So God is forgiving because he loves. So God's love is that he wants to forgive humanity. Now let's go into the context of this surah. So this surah comes from the late Meccan era. So there's a lot of focus often on the beginning, early revelation. So think of the chapter of Iqra, or recite. So when Muhammad was in the cave of Hira, he went and he was by himself meditating, and all of a sudden he hears this voice, and this voice says, recite, recite, recite. And then he says, I'm not a reciter, I don't read. And then the voice says, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. So read in the name of your Lord who created. So there's a lot of attention on this particular verse and this chapter. We also see other ones such as Surat al-Duha that talk about the idea that revelation had stopped for a moment or a long period of time, and the Prophet Muhammad began to feel isolated and feel that he was crazy, but then the revelation started and comforting him. And we see that there's a lot of focus on the late Meccan, the very end of the Meccan era, where the Prophet Muhammad was planning on migrating to Medina, and early delegations ended up going to Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was called during that time. Now, this late Meccan period is unique because the Muslim community was not just one or two people. So initially it was just the Prophet Muhammad and his close family. And you see that through the early Qur'anic chapters where they're only addressing one person. But later on, this community began to grow, but not to the point where it began to challenge the Meccan authority, and to the point that the majority of Meccans had actually embraced Islam. That will only come later. So this community had grown, but they were being persecuted and tortured, and to the point that later on, the Prophet would try to seek ways to leave Mecca. So the community here is in a state of desperation, vulnerability, and calling out to God. And you find that within this chapter itself, that when you read the chapter, it's a chapter that talks about the most merciful, God being kind to the believers. It's a chapter that talks about love, God loving the believers and humanity. And it's a chapter that talks about pain, whether that's the pain of Zachariah, who doesn't have a child, or that of Maryam, who's going through birth and feels isolated from her community. Now, today, let's focus on the first verse of Surat Maryam. And as I mentioned, it's only found in this particular chapter. So one of the things in Quranic studies that has gained a lot of attention is hapaxes, or the idea of a particular verse or even word being used only once. So if a word or a group of letters is used only once, it signals that this chapter or this verse is unique. So this chapter only has this beginning of Kaf Ha Ya Ain Sad, and this chapter only has this rhyme scheme that's not found anywhere else. So the beginning of the chapters in the Quran signal different things. So one of the things that they signal is a rhyme scheme. So if you look at Surat Noon, this is a chapter 68 in the Quran. It starts and it says Noon. And Noon here is the beginning letter. Now, why is that letter mentioned, right? And this is sometimes a debate among scholars. Now, this letter is mentioned because the rhyme scheme of that chapter is Noon. So if you continue to read, it says Noon, وَالْقَلَمِ وَمَا يَسْتُرُونَ, by the pen and what everyone writes. مَا أَنْتَ بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ بِمَجْنُونَ, and by the grace of your Lord, you are not insane. You're not a mad person. وَإِنَّ لَكَ لَأَجْرًا غَيْرَ مَمْنُونَ, and for you there will be a unlimitless reward. So as you can see that each verse ends with the letter Noon. يَسْتُرُونَ بِمَجْنُونَ مَمْنُونَ. So this beginning here of Noon speaks to the larger rhyme scheme of the entire chapter. Now, there are other beginnings of the Quran as well. And through the beginnings, you can see when the Quran was revealed or what era it comes from. So one of the early stories of the Muslim community and the Prophet Muhammad is that when he went to Cave Hira, he heard this voice, and then he ran back home to his wife Khadija. And in that moment, he told her what had happened, and she comforted him. And part of the seerah or the hadith reports, they say that the Prophet Muhammad said, "Zammiluni," so cover me, cover me. And then she covered him with a blanket and then continued to speak to his goodness and his contributions to society. So this verse is called Surat Maryam, and it starts and says, Ya ayyuhal muzammil, qum al-layla illa qalila. So it starts with this ya. You can hear Ya ayyuhal. So, oh, you who does this. And what is this person? This is a person who wraps themselves in clothing. And then the next verse says, stand at night, even if it's for a little bit. So begin the night prayer. So you have this imperative of kum, of stand up, and it's in a singular form, only speaking to one person. So you see here that the Quran is commanding in the divine voice, telling the Prophet Muhammad, oh, the one who wraps up, stand up in the night, even if it's for a little bit, in worship. So prepare yourself spiritually for this important journey. And then the next chapter is called Surat Mudaththir, and it has the same beginning. So, Ya ayyuhal mudaththir, oh, the one who's covered up in clothes, kum fa'anzir, right? Stand up once again, rise, and warn people. So the first chapter, chapter 73, it says, okay, to the Prophet Muhammad, you're all covered up, you're scared, but stand in prayer. Spiritually fortify yourself. And then the next chapter says to the person who's covered up in clothing, once again to the Prophet Muhammad, now stand up and warn people. Begin the mission of calling people back to the one true God. So what we see here is in these two chapters that we can see that they were revealed at a similar time. Both of them have a similar beginning, and both of them have similar imperatives, telling the Prophet Muhammad to do something, to stand up in a particular way. We also see that the Quran has certain beginnings that cluster it in particular eras. So in the second example, we saw Ya ayyuhal muzammil, Ya ayyuhal mudaththir, and there's been recent work on the late Meccan verses and chapters, which signal the idea of immigration. So you see that says Alif Lam Ra, Tilka Ayatul Kitab al-Mubin. So the chapter of Yusuf, begins with this interesting phrase of Alif Lam Ra. And then usually after this beginning, it says these are the verses of a clear book. So after Alif Lam Ra, there is this emphasis on the Quran being clear and as a guide. And we see that in the chapter of Joseph, there is this idea of immigration, of traveling. So in the story of Yusuf, he has this dream, he goes to his father, and then actually he goes out with his brothers, he's thrown into a well, and then he travels to Egypt. So this is important as it will foreshadow the life of the Prophet Muhammad, where he will go from Mecca to Medina and become a king, become a ruler and leader, and be considered to be righteous at the same time. And the last example that we'll give is that of the last two chapters in the Quran. So the last two chapters in the Quran are Surat al-Falaq and Surat al-Nas, or the chapter of the daybreak and the chapter of humanity or humankind. So they both start with a similar phrase, Kul a'udhu. So the first chapter, Kul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq. So it says, I seek refuge in the Lord of the daybreak. And then it goes and explains from the evil that's been created and those people who engage in sorcery. And then the next one says, Kul a'udhu bi rabbin nas. Say to the Prophet Muhammad, I seek refuge on the Lord of humanity, Malikin Nas, and the master of humankind. And then the chapter will continue and speak about the evils of people and the whisperings that encourage wrongdoings. So we see in these two chapters that they are paired together and they're often recited together. So a lot of Muslims will recite them before they go to sleep or when they engage in their daily life. So we see that the beginnings of the surahs are important because they can tell us unique things. So whether it's the rhyme scheme, whether it's when they were revealed, whether it's early or late Meccan or Medinan, they also tell us the function. So whether it's seeking refuge from God or seeking his grace, the beginning of the chapter is a signal about what will come. And when we look at the chapter of Maryam, we see that there is a unique rhyme scheme. And this rhyme scheme is connected in some ways to the beginning. We see in the chapter of Maryam that it begins with unique letters. These letters are not found in other parts of the Quran. They are clusters. There are certain 3 or 4 chapters that start with Hamim, or certain chapters that start with Alif Lam Mim, or other ones that speak with or begin with Alif Lam Ra. But here, Maryam, the chapter of Maryam, is unique because it starts with Kaf Ha Ya Ain Sad. Wonderful. So this was an introduction to Surat Maryam, as well as discussing its first verse of the Huruf al-Muqatta'a, or the separated letters, and how it signals all of us that the chapter of Maryam is unique and will have special lessons for all of us. Thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mari podcast. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Encourage your students, friends, and colleagues to listen to the podcast. Once again, you can text me. So I started a new feature where you can text me on the show notes and provide any feedback. And once again, please consider reviewing this podcast and visit my website, as well as joining my newsletter, which will update you on my forthcoming book. Thanks once again, and I look forward to being in touch. Take care.